We just returned to Europe from the US, and what we saw there shocked us. Hey guys, and welcome back to our channel. I am Donnie, and along with my wife Aubrey, we are two Americans currently living in Germany with our baby, sharing all of our experiences living and traveling throughout Europe. We've been living in Germany for over 4.5 years now, but just took a trip back home to the States to visit family. This was the first time that I had been back to the States for over a year, and the trip before that was the first time that I had been back to the States for over 2 years. After spending so much time outside the US and so much time in Germany, an interesting change in me has happened where life in Germany and really Europe as a whole has become our new normal, and going back to the US has become the bigger culture shock experience. Now, you might say that sounds a bit exaggerated considering we are still Americans after all, but with a combination of things changing a lot in the US since we left it, or things like we became parents in Europe rather than the US, so we never noticed the differences between parenting in the US and Europe before, there are just some things we never expected to be shocked by when going between both places. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about today in my video. In danger of becoming a stranger in my own land. Let me first say that some of these differences and culture shocks are going to be a little more specific to where we are originally from, a southern US state called Oklahoma, and where we live now in the southwestern German state of Rheinland-Pfalz. Like, for example, Oklahoma is known for having one of the absolute lowest costs of living in the US, and for us, the prices for eating out, for example, are basically frozen in time in our brains. What I mean is, what we used to pay 6 years ago when we last lived in the US is what we still expect to pay, but that has definitely changed, and just like everywhere else, life has gotten more expensive. However, the biggest reverse culture shock we experienced in this way was the price difference in pastries and breads that you pay there versus here in our part of Europe. We went to 2 different bakeries in Oklahoma. Yes, surprise, there are bakeries that bake fresh breads, and you can find more than just toast bread in the US, but honestly, I was dumbfounded at the cost of these baked goods. For example, one baguette at one of the bakeries cost $5, or a mini baguette, which was maybe about a third of a regular baguette, cost $3.50. Whereas where we live, I can pop over to France where the average price for a baguette in 2022 was just 90 cents. And boulangeries were lamenting the fact that they might have to raise the price to €1.50. Here in Germany, I can go grab a baguette from our local bakery for just around €2.50. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know everything that goes into baking and selling these products to say whether or not these prices are justified, but there seems to be a different mentality towards these goods in Europe and the US. In Europe, these types of baked goods, whether it be a baguette or another type of local baked bread, are just staples of life and therefore seem to be priced as staples of life where people can afford them. However, in the US, fresh baked breads like this from a bakery are sometimes viewed as a luxury item and are therefore priced as luxury items. Because they're handmade and artisanal, people think they should be paying high prices for these items. Again, the main difference being where French people might be buying a baguette daily or multiple times a week, a $5 baguette is just absurd. But for an American that buys a baguette for a special occasion, $5 is a reasonable price for a specialty item, I guess. The prices for baked goods were one major reverse culture shock we experienced in the US, but this wasn't the only shock at American bakeries, or really at nearly every coffee shop or restaurant we went to. One thing we also were unfortunately reminded of was the widespread practice of serving almost everything on paper or plastic. One place in particular that surprised me was at the high-end bakery in our hometown that even had tables and chairs for you to sit and enjoy their goods there. But even if you were going to do that, they still just brought our breads and pastries in a large paper box and gave us paper cups for our coffees. Now, I'm going to completely ignore the environmental aspect of this type of packaging, although we all know the problems there with this, and instead, what about just talking about the experience of this? We couldn't believe we had just paid those high prices and still were only given our food in disposable containers. To be honest, where in the past I probably wouldn't have thought anything about it and would have just focused on the contents of the package, now I have gotten used to enjoying the whole experience of enjoying my food in non-disposable disposable vessels, as simple as that is. But again, not just bakeries. Coffee shops would also just default to putting your drink in a paper cup with a plastic lid without asking if you were staying or going. And honestly, it didn't matter because a lot of them only had these types of drink containers. What happened to actual plates and cups, people? Now, obviously this wasn't 100% the case, and at most sit-down restaurants, you're going to receive your food on real plates and with real cutlery and real cups, but it was still at a much higher rate than I ever would have expected, based on what we've become used to in Europe. We have a 1-year-old, and as 1-year-olds do, they sometimes require diaper changes. And one of, more so, Aubrey's biggest frustrations in Germany is how typically only women's restrooms are outfitted with changing tables. Sure, sometimes you will find a changing table outside of restrooms that either parent can use, or there are a few exceptions we've found where men's restrooms have a table. But as a very standard rule, women's restrooms are the ones that accommodate for this need. It's actually become a bit of a joke for us where we are out and about and this need arises, and I get to look really good by offering to change his diaper, all while we both know full and well that the changing table will only be in the women's restroom, but I go and check and have to come back and deliver the unfortunate news that our assumptions were right. But this has always felt very, I don't know, old-timey and gender roles conforming rather than treated as something fathers can also do. By the way, I can't tell you how many times I've changed his diaper in other random places when a changing table was only available in the women's restroom. I do my part too, people. But because we had gotten so used to this being the case in Germany, and in particular since we became parents in Germany, and that's just where we have taken note of this, we were very surprised that in the US, at basically 100% of places we went, the men's restrooms were also outfitted with a diaper changing table. So much so that I got to the point where I didn't even have to go check to see if there was one before trying to change my son's diapers. Rather, I was just able to gather our stuff and him and go straight back there without the expectation that I would be let down. In this one very specific way, I felt like parenting in the US is viewed as more of an equal job, or at the very least, like shops and restaurants were acknowledging that maybe just simply fathers might possibly be out with their children alone and may have to take care of this need. Overall, we found it to be a very positive reverse culture shock. We've talked over and over in our videos about how driving in Germany can be a completely different experience than in America, and how overall, I will admit that I believe German drivers are significantly better, and how I personally enjoy sharing the roads with them over American drivers. Well, this last trip, I was reminded of another difference that made me appreciate driving in Germany even more, and that is the distances to places and just the sheer amount of time required to drive to destinations compared to Germany. First off, I think it is common knowledge that things in the US are just simply more spread out than in Germany, and that is particularly true in the suburbs. And until you experience it for yourself, you can't really appreciate just how spread out things are. With the combination of nearly every building seemingly requiring a huge lot surrounding the building, plus a huge parking lot to accommodate all the vehicles, there just simply isn't walking between places. And to be fair, some would argue this is actually a positive in their eyes because you don't feel cramped. And when you're used to that, Germany and Europe as a whole can feel a bit claustrophobic and like everything is just stacked on top of each other. So there are different perspectives on this based on your worldview for sure. But because of this, I had the feeling that there was no simply just popping over to where we wanted to go. Rather, we had to dedicate a decent amount of time just to drive everywhere. This made me feel like we spent half of our trip just sitting in the car rather than actually out and about. But the other thing that I noticed that really made this even worse, in my humble opinion, was the number of stoplights everywhere. Americans just haven't adopted roundabouts like Europe has yet, and still, and particularly in our hometown, stoplights are used at nearly every single intersection. Sometimes you would be driving and every block have to stop at a red light, or maybe you would finally get a green light, but drive just a few hundred feet before you met another and another and another traffic light, because between all the major intersections, all the minor intersecting roads, and some parking lots also had stoplights as cars tried to make their ways to the main roads. Again, making me feel like we were just crawling to get anywhere. Now, I do again want to mention that experiences with this are going to vary based on where you live. For example, we do live in a more rural part of Germany and don't drive in major cities often these days, where most intersections in our area are roundabouts, and therefore traffic continues moving relatively smoothly as we don't have to stop and wait for a light to change. And I will admit, we visited family in Texas, and in this area that we were specifically in, I was surprised and impressed with how many intersections have changed to roundabouts and were in the process of being adapted to roundabouts. So this does look like it may be changing, at least there, and that made me excited about the future of driving there. One of the original culture shocks that we had in Germany was learning about how digitalization is such a big political topic in Germany, and how shocked we were to find out how many places in Germany required us to carry cash as they did not accept card payments. I will admit that a lot of that has changed even in the nearly 5 years that we've lived in Germany, and that was especially spurred on by the pandemic, but still to this day, we are surprised to find out how many places are cash only in Germany. However, I will have to give praise to Germany where praise is due and say that one reverse culture shock we experience in the US is due to the much more far-reaching acceptance of Apple Pay here when card is accepted than what we found in the US. Although I almost hadn't touched any American cash for years before moving to Germany and relied solely on using cards, the US is quite behind when it comes to Apple Pay. One big reason behind this is the difference in how card payments are taken at restaurants between Germany and the US. Where in Germany, a waiter brings a card reader to your table and you can simply just tap your card there, and therefore you are able to use your phone and Apple Pay if you want. In the US, you still hand your card to the waiter who wanders off with it to pay at a central kiosk. Therefore, you aren't handing your phone to the waiter for them to be able to use Apple Pay and that convenience that comes with that service. There's other theories like how in the US, card payments are well established, so changing that mentality and norm takes a lot more effort than somewhere like in Germany, where, for example, I just mentioned it was a very cash-heavy society. So when they make the change to accepting cashless payments, they just accept what is the latest tech, and that is systems like Apple Pay. Whatever the reason, I would be interested in knowing from you guys, do you like using Apple Pay, cash, or cards the best? To see who made it this far into the video, the random question of the week is, what is your favorite genre of music? Thanks so much for watching, guys. Be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and I will see you in my next video. We just returned to Europe from the US because they are handmade and artisanal. Because they're handmade and artisanal, and where we live now in the southwestern German state of Rhineland.